Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss reports that UK ports who spent a bit of a fortune on building up checking facilities to cope with our post-Brexit trade barriers say they should be compensated if the Labour government now reduce those trade barriers. Now, I have a great deal of sympathy for part of their position, as I'll explain, but I do have questions about whether, when working on their business plan, they ever stopped to consider that there were a few problems in their thinking. Did our UK port authorities even understand what Brexit was going to do? Because it's one thing that idiots like Boris Johnson had no idea what Brexit was going to mean. But people who actually run trade logistics, that's a bit more of a worry. But anyway, before I get onto that, what's going on with Brexit investment by various port authorities? Well, by leaving both the customs union and single market, we were going to need way more checks on goods passing into Britain and out of Britain with the EU. The areas covered by the customs union single market are different, but as the heaviest traffic is between Britain and France, that covers both. So we'll focus on Dover here, though some of the issues exist elsewhere as well. So before the hard Brexit, we only needed to carry out standards checks for goods coming in from outside the single market. I mean directly from outside the single market, like straight from wherever it was coming from, or the last non-single market port it was coming from to Britain, and customs checks for those coming from outside the customs union. All of a sudden, everything coming into Dover was coming from outside both our market and our customs area. So in order to maintain border security, we literally needed to increase the number of checks 100-fold. Only this is impossible. There isn't the physical room to build that infrastructure because it's in the sea, or employ the officials needed to carry the work out. But we did need to build up facilities above pre-Brexit levels, and we didn't do that either. The Tories deliberately built almost nothing in advance in order to hide the massive disruption that Brexit was going to cause. If you recall, in 2020, we'd already left the EU, but we were getting ready to leave the single market and customs union, and all those lorry parks just suddenly sprang up in Kent. A bit of a surprise to the people of Kent, who'd voted both Tory and Brexit, because they weren't expecting it. There was no advance warning, and it certainly wasn't. The building didn't start well in advance, which of course meant that it wasn't fully functioning by the time it was built. But the consequences are now with us. Whenever we get loads of people heading to Dover for the purposes of tourism to the continent, like now, for example, we also see a strangulation of traffic flows, which hits freight as well. But that's the general background. Don't need to go over all that again. In terms of the issue with ports and Brexit facilities, their complaint is that at the behest of the last government, they invested a lot of money in building checking facilities which are not really being used. The latest is that if Labour managed to negotiate things like, say, the veterinary agreement, and that results in lots of trade treks disappearing, those facilities will not be needed. That means their investment will never be recouped. Now, my thought process on the fairness of this went through a few stages. Like, the first thought is like, you know, if we do manage to get some deals with the EU, which will significantly reduce trade checks, the cost of compensating port authorities will be quite small compared to the savings made by having easier trade. Because remember, every time a lorry goes to one of those checking facilities to have something checked, there's a charge. So the port authorities charge for that. That's extra money. That's not money. That's not an investment. That's not like the cost of transporting the goods. That is an extra cost that we didn't used to have, and that cost gets passed on to the consumer. It also means, because of the paperwork involved, it's more hassle for whoever's sending those goods to send them. So those checks represent higher cost to British consumers, it's more inflation, and extra hassle and maybe cost to some businesses in the EU who've got a much larger market to sell to much more easily. So we become more of a hassle. So there's all sorts of reasons to go, do you know what? If we have to pay out for these white elephant buildings that were never going to be used, that's a small price to pay for the benefits that we will once again get. But then my second thought was, these facilities aren't really being used right now. It's not like, oh, they're being used, the business plan is working, and Labour are threatening it. In fact, I've talked in the past about how some are not being used at all. There have been some of these buildings built, and they've never been used. And that is because, although the government did indeed urge ports to build the extra facilities needed for checks, They never authorised those checks to take place in any significant numbers. Even with the standards checks regimes introduced by Rishi Sunak this year, we're not carrying out many actual checks. The same applied to customs checks. They began at the start of 2022, a year late. We prioritise traffic flow over compliance, so smugglers are having a great old time. So even if Labour don't succeed in getting their desired deals with the EU, or it takes them many years to do so, those facilities are not being used right now anyway. And here's where I have a question. Given that it was predictable that this would happen, it was predictable that the government would not want to see deadlock at our ports and goods not getting into the country, goods expiring, like food going off, medicines not getting to pharmacies, which that's already happening, but on a much greater scale. No government was going to allow that. Why did those port authorities invest all that money in facilities that were unlikely to be used without cast iron guarantees from the government? I mean, surely they understood that if those facilities had been used as planned, it would have slowed incoming freight down to a crawl, leading to major supply chain problems. We've got shortages on the shelves, but very obvious shortages on the shelves, much higher inflation, and the political suicide of the government. I mean, if even I knew that, listening to various logistics experts, how on earth did people actually planning logistics programs at Dover not understand that? Did they, at any point in their business planning, not consider, maybe the government that's so clearly shown no understanding of what a hard Brexit's going to do for so many years might also change how they approach it after the event. Maybe they can't be fully trusted. At which point some sympathy starts to drain away from me. Had I been involved in the decision making of these new facilities, I would definitely be putting my hand up and going, hang on a minute, how do you know that these checking facilities are going to be used? The government say so. Yeah, but that's going to mean massively increased times to get goods to where they need to go, which means some goods then won't be able to get there because we talk about fresh food, obviously that goes off, but then even for some other things, like for some companies, they need to get stuff in when they order it, they need it a few days later at most. 2 weeks later, not really going to cut the ice. And it's because the government, I know the government lost the election anyway, so I can't say, if they'd have allowed all these checks to go ahead, they'd have lost the election. They did anyway. But that's because they got literally everything wrong, not just one or two things. But this alone, if they'd have actually implemented post-Brexit checks as they should to maintain border security, that alone would lose you the election. No government was going to think it was going to get away with being responsible for very visible shortages on the shelves and hyperinflation, because that's what would have happened. And they'd already shown with their approach to customs that they would prioritise traffic over checks. They were open about that. Who seriously thought the same government, which was prepared to wave through goods without customs checks, costing us tens of billions a year in tax revenues, who'd have thought they would not do the same for standards checks? Now, don't get me wrong, I have sympathy for the fact our government failed to provide a stable environment for businesses to properly plan, because that's what it should do. The government should give businesses years in advance, like, this is the lay of the land. When you're doing your business planning, this is the lay of the land. This is our direction. This is what we're going to do. And when the government say they're going to do something, they should have planned properly to make sure that they will actually stick to it. That is the job of government. But, and it doesn't just hurt the profits of these companies. It harms jobs as well. It harms our reputation, putting future investment at risk. But it is also an example of private business which planned to make money out of Brexit checks, seemingly not considering that those Brexit checks would be too harmful politically for a government to go through with. And what are they now asking for? That if things had panned out as expected, they'd have made profits on their investment. But now that it hasn't, they want the taxpayer to cover the losses. Now, although this is probably the tamest example of it, because this is ultimately the fault of a dangerously incompetent government, it's still an example of privatising profits and nationalising losses, isn't it? Especially as, like I keep saying, I think they must have been mad to think we were just going to implement these checks as the government said they would. The government commissioned Operation Yellowhammer. I mean, if you read that, it's quite clear the severe disruption that was going to be caused by a hard Brexit. Like, there's no way a government wanted anything close to that to actually happen. So although I do think that the previous government treated our port authorities quite badly, and like I said, I wouldn't worry too much about a bit of compensation being paid out because we'd more than make up for it with higher tax revenues with a better trade. Can't help shake the thought that if all of this was predictable and predicted, why on earth those working on business plans did not include the prospect of the government not fully implemented checks into their thinking. Remember, back in 2020, before David Frost came onto the scene as the Brexit minister, it was Michael Gove, and he was talking about the fact we were going to need to hire 50,000 officials to do these extra Brexit checks. Now, 50,000, that would have made our civil service, the UK civil service, bigger than the entire civil service for the whole of the EU. That just shows you the scale of this task. It was never going to happen. We were never going to be able to hire 50,000 people to do these checks. Imagine the situation, hiring, you imagine in your workplace and you have someone start at new, someone mentors them, shows them the ropes, stuff like that. Imagine 50,000 people who've never done this job before, working you. Who's going to mentor them? They massively outnumber the experienced hands. It's not feasible. And it never happened. We never got anywhere close to it. And we knew all this years ago. I talked about it myself. Should those responsible for failing to plan for this fairly obvious outcome not take some responsibility as well? Apart from anything else, it doesn't give me much confidence in the competence of our port authorities if they're basically admitting they didn't understand how a hard Brexit would impact things any better than Boris Johnson. When your average experienced transcontinental lorry driver knew exactly what was going to happen. I know because I paid attention to what they had to say. A pity the project managers at Dover's didn't listen to them. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'll see you later.